Hello and welcome back for another episode of Learning to Turn with me, Bo Lagouge. In the last episode, we shaped the outside of the bowl. Today, we're going to be focusing on the inside, hollowing that out, at least the first phase of that. It's a two cut operation. I'll probably be doing both of those cuts at the same time, but one will be one episode and the second operation with the bottom bowl gouge will be a separate episode. But before we do any of that, we need to be able to reverse this piece and mount it on the chuck the other way. You'll recall that up until now we've been using a recessed cut to mount this way on the chuck with the jaws pressing out to hold it on. For this operation from here forward, we're going to be using a tenon, which mounts like so inside the chuck with the jaws cinching down onto it. A good tenon has two key characteristics. It needs to be undercut in this dimension, a dovetail, which is what the inside of the jaws grab hold of. And in this dimension, parallel to the bottom and the top, it needs to have a plane or a shoulder that seats against the face of the jaws. And that's critical that you have a good contact there. That provides what Stuart refers to, and perhaps all turners, as location, which keeps the piece from moving even a little bit as you're pressing your gouge into the bowl and putting force on that wood. If you don't have a good union, good location between the shoulder and the face of the jaws, then the piece of wood will be able to wobble, flex, etc., and that will keep you from having good control of the tool and clean cuts. All of that is achieved with a single operation, a single cut, just rolling the bowl gouge into the face of the wood, provides both the shoulder and the dovetail. One other detail in the case of smaller tenons, and almost all of mine are going to be small because the bowls are fairly small. With smaller tenons, it's important to have what's called a chamfer, or an angle on the back corner of the tenon, which in ways that I don't really understand apparently help to keep the tenon from snapping off in the event of a catch. Luckily, you get the chamfer for free when you've already shaped the bowl, because we'll be cutting the tenon in down about here, and it's basically pre-chamfered, so that comes for free. That about does it for the general comment, so let's get specific about the particulars for this operation. Stance is left foot forward. The tool rest is going to be parallel to the bottom of the bowl, and therefore my left hand position will be overhand, reaching over the tool rest. Tool is the 40-40 bowl gouge. I'll be using the Papa Bear. Tool rest position is standard, slightly below center, and about 1/2 inch from the wood. Vertical position starts off at about 10, maybe 15 degrees down, and through the course of the cut, I'll be lifting the handle as I roll it in. Horizontal position is basically in plane with the bottom of the bowl, but just a little bit angled so that the tip of the tool cuts in deeper. That leaves the shoulder proud on the outside, which makes for a better mate with the face of the chuck. Let's see, what else? Flute is almost completely closed at 9/30, and as you see, this cut will be basically cutting straight in to the bottom of the bowl. That gives you a cut into side grain. If I were to come in this way, I'd be cutting into end grain. We never want to do that. I believe that covers it all, so I'll rearrange my cameras and have a go at this. See you on the other side. So I'm afraid that this episode is going to sound a whole lot like a repeat of the episode where we covered cutting the recess for mounting on the jaws as it currently is, because this operation that seemed like it would be relatively simple turned out to be a challenge. and with me making basically the same mistakes. So here's one where I'm having trouble just getting started without the tool skating. I think I get a handle on this fairly quickly, not only on this one, but I don't recall having quite that same challenge on future ones. But so the real problems that you're going to see that I have here are getting the angles correct. We have two angles that I'll talk a bit more about shortly, and both of them proved to be a bit of a challenge for me. And getting the size right, both the diameter and the length or depth of the tenon. And we'll return to that one in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about the angles. So I don't think I explained particularly well in the on-camera intro how the angles are supposed to work here, using the 40-40 bowl gouge to create both of those angles at the same time. And the two angles, again, are the undercut or dovetail for the jaws to grab hold of, and the shoulder that mates against the face of the jaws. That face, the shoulder, in a perfect world, you could make that perfectly level or parallel to the bottom, and you'd get a really good location or seat of the jaws against the shoulder. If you're going to err one way or the other, you definitely want to err on the side of making it deeper at the inside, or right by where the dovetail ends, and a little more proud on the outside where the jaws are meeting at the farthest out point. If you do it the opposite way and you have the heel of the gouge cut farther instead of the nose, then you're creating kind of a convex situation where the shoulders are retreating from the jaws, and the contact is only at the tip of the dovetail jaws, not out at the outside, which reduces the support that you get. And I think just fairly quickly here we're going to be zooming in and slowing down to see where I was making a mistake with exactly that. And I ended up on that particular cut where the shoulder was angled with the outside being cut too deep, and I wouldn't have gotten a good seat. So I'm coming back and having another go. I know that the camera angle here doesn't exactly make this real evident, but trust me, I could tell that I had that angle wrong. So that one, you're going for, in a perfect world, perfectly level. But if you're going to err, you make it a degree or two deeper at the nose than at the heel of the gouge. And here's where the angles of the gouge come in, because as I tried to explain in the intro, when we're using a 40-40 bowl gouge as we are here, it's cutting an 80-degree angle. That's 10 degrees shy of 90 degrees. Now we're spending 2 degrees of that, hypothetically, on the slight angle to keep the outside of the shoulder proud of the inside of the shoulder. That leaves about 8 degrees, maybe 9 degrees, for the undercut of the dovetail. Well, I was having trouble achieving that using the 40-40 bowl gouge, and so you may have just noticed while I was talking here that on this blank I resorted to a different tool to cut the angle, namely a parting tool. And I think, at least in part in this case as a result, you can see I just reversed it and tried to put it into the chuck and tighten the chuck down, and the tenon was too small, at least for those jaws, so that it simply doesn't, the jaws aren't holding the blank in the chuck. So that's a complete failure when it comes to creating a tenon. That tenon is useless, at least with those jaws. And that's something we'll be returning to later in the episode. So getting back to how this is supposed to work, at least according to my understanding, I'm supposed to position the tool before starting the cut with the wing essentially parallel with the bottom, flaring it out, moving the handle to my right just a hair to make sure if it's off in the right direction. And then simply push with my right hand straight in the line of the tool. And that should basically ride the bevel in and create that 8 to 9 degree undercut for the dovetail. And that's what I was trying to do, but I guess part of it is I was also trying to do this maneuver starting with the handle down and swinging it up as I made entry the way I saw Stuart doing it. And I think somewhere in the course of that compound maneuver I was getting my angles off. And at least to my eye, and again, just as I said with the episode about cutting the recess, it's entirely possible that there was more angle there and here than my eye was seeing, and that it looked more square than it actually was. But it certainly looked too square for my liking, as meaning that I was afraid that once I reversed this piece and put it on the chuck, that I wasn't going to have enough of a dovetail there for the jaws to get a really good grip on. And of course, anytime I tried to correct that by angling the tool in a little bit more to cut more of a dovetail, then I ran into the problem that you saw back on blank number 5, where the shoulder was not angled properly, so I wasn't going to get a good seat. So that was a struggle to get all of that put together correctly, particularly on the first dozen or so blanks. I think that about does it on the angles discussion. Let's talk about dimensions. So you'll recall that with the recesses, I made a mistake on the diameter where I cut them too small and the chuck wouldn't fit inside the recess, so I had to recut them, it was a hassle, but it wasn't too big a problem because it's always easy to cut something bigger, right? In this case, cutting a hole bigger. I guess if you're talking about cutting a 2x4 longer, it doesn't work so well. But in this case, I was cutting out more wood to make the recess bigger. Unfortunately, in this case, we've already seen one, and I assure you there were more, where I cut the tenon too small, and there's no remedy for that, at least with a given set of jaws. One remedy is to basically remove that tenon and cut a deeper one, and at that point you're making the bowl shorter. So that was one option I had. Fortunately, I had some other jaws, smaller jaws, that I could use instead and just make the tenon smaller to fit those jaws, which of course is what I ended up doing. As to what caused the diameter of several of the tenons to end up too small, that was just a function of recutting to get the angle right, and each time the tenon got smaller. Here's the one. I was wrong before. Maybe I did it on 5 as well, but here's the one where, and you can actually see it a bit here, where the angle there is kind of convex instead of concave. And I'm going to try and rectify that by coming in with the bowl gouge in a slicing cut to level it out. I'm not sure what we were supposed to be looking at back on blank number 5. Sorry about that. So now that I have leveled off the shoulder with that slicing cut, I need to come in and clean up the corner where the shoulder meets the dovetail. And you can see there that right now there's a ridge of wood, which if I left it there would end up interfering with the jaws seating properly, getting both a good grip and good location. So I'm coming back in with the parting tool to clean that up. And incidentally, I stopped recording here and went back to check on what the feature was supposed to be when we slowed down for blank number 5, and it was all about using the parting tool for cleaning up and getting the right angle, a good angle on the dovetail. Here I'm using the same slicing cut that I used just a second ago to level off the shoulder, which is a cut I don't think we've talked about before. It gives you a nice clean cut, much nicer than the scraping cut that we've used to flatten off the face. I'm not going to go into it right now. We'll come back to that in actually the very last episode where we're taking off the tenon. But right now I'm going to toss it to myself on camera to talk about the issues we've been having and a new game plan. Well, as I'd imagine is perfectly evident by now, things are not going as smoothly as I expected with this cut that was supposed to be so easy and simple. I'm having two problems. One is the geometry is not coming out right. So I'm not getting enough of a dovetail for the jaws to grab hold of. To correct for that, I've been coming in at a steeper angle, but then I have to swing the handle at the end in order to get the undercut on the shoulder. In the course of making that correction, I'm getting a rounded corner instead of a nice sharp one, so I'm not sure that the jaws will be able to bite into there and then draw down and have the face of the jaws nice and flush against the shoulder. So that's one problem. The bigger problem, I guess, because that all might work out, these might be acceptably good tenons, but what is completely unacceptable is several of them, the majority of them, have turned out too small. That means I have no chance. The chuck won't hold on to them at all. They're just flopping around in there. It's no good under any circumstances. Fortunately, on that front, I started off cutting the tenons larger than I had planned on. I cut them for the 4-inch jaws instead of the 2-inch jaws, and that allows me now to go smaller. I'll be recutting them to 2-inch and should be able to, well, assuming I don't make the same mistake again, should be able to recover from that mistake. And I'll be able to work on my technique more. The main change I'll be making is I'll be making the cut more straight in, less lift of the tool. Rewatched some of the videos with, I only have 2 of them actually, where it shows Stuart doing this, and noticed that I was doing too much lift of the handle in the course of this operation, so I'll be going more just straight in, and definitely no more swing. I need to go straight, make the cut. The deal here is that this gouge, the 40-40 gouge, 40 plus 40 equals 80. The angle from here, from the wing to the bevel, is 80 degrees. That's less than 90 degrees. So if I come in at the right angle, I'll get, like an 8-inch dovetail, which gives me the bite plus a degree or 2 for the recess or don't know what the right term is there. So the shoulder is a little higher on the outside than the inside, and that gives me both of the angles that I need here. So use the 80 degrees to my advantage, one straight cut. Here's hoping I get it right this time. Let's see. So we're actually going to go through the recutting of the ones that were too small. Forget the numbering up there. That's doesn't really factor in the fact that these were already done. I spent a few minutes, actually more than a few minutes, trying to correlate each blank to the original number, and that ended up being kind of a lost cause. More work than it was worth. Not sure what happened to the lighting here, why it's suddenly so dark, but I guess we'll have to live with that. And you can see I'm now doing a much simpler cut as described in the little intermission segment there. Simply putting it in position and straight push to get the angle. Notice that these ones, when remounted, it's sometimes hard to get them back on the chuck exactly centered. It's puzzling because you'd think the way the chuck works, it would kind of automatically center, but I guess there's enough eccentricity that it doesn't always work out that way. So I believe before the intermission I was talking about what happened to cause the foot to get too small, and that it was principally just a function of reworking the bevel to get it just right, get a decent undercut for the dovetail, and that, you know, each cut, if you're taking off a millimeter or so, suddenly what remains is too small. I was even trying to err on the large side to begin with the calipers or the compass marking the spot, and I think I did that, but I didn't factor in that I was getting smaller as I worked on the shape. Since I am now cutting the tenon to work with my smallest jaws, I'd be completely hosed if I got it too small at this point. As I said before, the fallback option then would be to basically remove the tenon altogether and cut a new one, and thereby shorten the bowl more than I certainly would want to. Which actually leads me to the other issue here. We've talked obviously about the dimension in the diameter of the tenon being wrong, but the other dimension to consider is the depth or height of the tenon. And in general, I've been making these considerably fatter, taller, whatever, than they need to be. Minimum for a small bowl is about 1/8 of an inch. I think ideal is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch. And I couldn't tell you exactly how big some of these are, but I can just tell you they were way deeper than they needed to be. Which has a couple of impacts. I mean, if you make it really too big, then it actually becomes a physical problem, because the tenon is too deep to set in the jaws, and that ends up actually being an impediment that you then have to deal with, and you basically have to shorten it further just so the thing will go in the chuck. But short of that, the problem is that making the tenon deeper than it needs to be. I'm going to interrupt myself here. For last few blanks here, I'm turning the tool rest to basically the same angle that it would have been at, more or less, when shaping the outside of the bowl. And that's another way that Stuart sometimes does his cuts his tenon. The thing it allows you to do is to go to an underhand grip instead of the overhand, which Stuart definitely seems prefer. I haven't done enough of this to have developed a preference. So the problems with making it too thick, one is that you're going to end up removing the tenon when it's all said and done, and so the bigger the tenon is, the more wood you're removing. Effectively, the shorter you're making the bowl. So just in the conservation of the wood and making the bowl as big as it can be, making the tenon fatter than it needs to be is necessarily shortening your bowl. And perhaps a bigger problem is that it increases the risk of cutting through the bottom of the bowl, either in the course of hollowing it out or when in the final step you're removing the tenon. And that's because at least I am using the outside of the bowl as the guide as I'm hollowing it out. And having flattened the bowl so much by putting a big deep tenon on there, is kind of creating an optical illusion, because my eye doesn't really factor in how much it gets flattened off. And so it's kind of following it around the first third of the corner and imagining that it continues more than it does. And I don't want to give too much away, but I'll just tell you, this comes back to haunt me in both ways that I just discussed. So keep the tenon as thin as is safe for the chuck to have something to hold on to, and for the tenon to be structurally sound so that it's not going to tear out. And of course, I just compounded this problem when I initially cut the tenons too small for the 4-inch jaws and had to recut them at a smaller diameter, which effectively flattened the bowl still further. I'm going to throw up a graphic here that I created to really demonstrate this. And you can see the one on the left is a good tenon, not too deep, not too much of a shoulder. The middle one is what I did initially, with the tenon too deep and a little bit wider than it needed to be. And then the one on the right is what happened when I had to then cut it smaller. Now let's add a shape to represent the bowl hollowed out, kind of in cross section, where as you're cutting the inside, you're following the curvature of the outside radius. And you can see with this good tenon, it all works out fine. But what happens with the other two? When that line that you're carving intersects with the shoulder, bad things happen. Keep this in mind when we get to the hollowing out episode, specifically the bottom bowl gouge one. We'll have a fine example of how that does not end well for the bowl. In some of these, this is one of them. If I were smart, I would have basically planned on making these for the smaller jaws in the first place, and then not had to shorten them as much. Now, in this case, even since I was planning on them being for the smaller jaws, I still had to shorten that particular blank because it was so conical that the tenon would have the original diameter of the bottom was too small even for my small jaws. We are down to the next to the last blank here. And I'd like to say that by this point I actually was feeling okay about my process and the results. I'd say I'm still making the tenon a little thicker, deeper than it needs to be. But I'm at least getting the angles the way I want them to be. Right there, you've seen me do that several times now, but I haven't commented on it. That is just a little cut at an angle to bevel or put a chamfer on the corner of the tenon. I think I might have been off by one when I said on number 23 that we were coming to the last one. I thought there were only 24, but it looks like we had 25. And we're going to slow down to regular speed for this last one. One thing I think I'm going to invest in, not a big investment in the larger scheme of things, but a compass that is locking. It's just too easy to think that you have your compass set to the right size, and somewhere along the way it gets squeezed or whatever to change its size. You don't realize it, and next thing you know, you have a bad reference. I obviously found enough ways to get it wrong through mistakes in technique and execution without needing any more help from a gauge that isn't right. Well, that about does it for this episode. I hope that in spite of the numerous missteps I made along the way, that you were able to get something out of this, and in the larger spirit of this series, that all of the skills involved in making a bowl are not too daunting to learn, and that even when you make mistakes, they're generally recoverable, and you just keep moving forward and getting better at it. And with that, I'll bid you adieu. Thank you for watching, and welcome you back for the next episode when we actually will be hollowing out these blanks. Cheers.